With the release of Nvidia's RTX 3050, it marks the first time that RTX features such as DLSS and hardware-based ray tracing have become available to owners of a 50 class GPU. We'll be investigating in this video how much sense ray tracing makes to a GPU of this class, but DLSS, well, arguments for that are pretty obvious. Lowering the overhead that your GPU has when rendering a frame and then upsampling to a higher resolution, it's beneficial not really respective of the class of the GPU. High performance cards such as the RTX 3080 obviously are great for 4K with DLSS, but when it comes to the lower performance tiers, with an RTX 3050, with DLSS, can we perhaps get 1440p results at a decent frame rate? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we'll be investigating that very question, as well as the ray tracing one, in this very video. Now, let's start things out with a few basics. The RTX 3050 is not available with a Founders Edition model, meaning that the only way you can get one of these is through an AIB custom variant. We're going to be reviewing Gigabyte's Eagle variant, which was sent to us by Nvidia. And as you can see from the look of this card, it's pretty cute, if you want to call the card cute. And compared to the RTX 3080 Ti here, it's absolutely, well, minuscule. And now for the elephant in the room, mining performance. For our testing here, I tested not only NB Miner, but also NiceHash. Let's start things out with NB Miner. I reduced the power limit of the board, as you would do when mining, and also increased the clock frequency of the memory too. I went up to 1175 megahertz in this screenshot that you can see, but yeah, we started to notice instability, so I backed down to the same clock frequency I was running with gaming, overclocking, which was 1080. We'll get more into that in just a moment. And I also, of course, as I said, ran this with NiceHash as well. Now, I want to stress that I'm not the world's best miner, but you can probably get some idea. By the way, with NiceHash, I ran it with default power limits, but with the the memory overclock in place, and you can see here the results. Now, this is definitely not the best mining card out there. It tells me that it is LHR anyway, so I suspect that this card is probably not going to be targeted by miners, but as always with this stuff, we'll have to wait and see. As we discussed in the beginning of this review, the TBP of this card is 130 watts, with the reference clock frequency of the RTX 3050 and this Eagle model being 1777 MHz with 14 GPPS memory. Here you can see control running with all of the ray tracing settings on, DLSS 2, and well, 1440p to boot. This will push the Tensor and RT cores of the silicon as well. You can see that the clock frequency of the core hovers around 1900 MHz, about typical behaviour from any modern card. Providing you've got the juice and temperature headroom, it will go a bit higher than its advertised speeds thanks to GPU boost. Temperatures, as you can also see, were decent enough, generally hovering in the low 60s. Typical behaviour I've personally observed with this card when the fans are left to their default settings. The fans, speaking of them, are basically silent enough during most workloads, and I suspect really you probably won't hear them anyway, even if they do ramp up to between 70 and 80%. Of course, your mileage will vary depending on the case and how close it is to your head. So, what about overclocking then? Well, we did test out overclocking with this card. Now, I want to stress that your mileage will definitely vary when it comes to overclocking any particular GPU. For this Eagle RTX 3050, we started out with the most obvious thing, and that is cranking the power limits. The power limits of this particular GPU are 110%, so we maxed those out. So we nudged the core to 130 MHz and added 1080 MHz to the RAM. Now, I did have the memory running at 1130 MHz, actually faster when it came to mining, but I noticed there was some instability starting to creep in, so I backed down to 1080. Personally, I just feel that a fraction of an extra FPS is not really worth trying to optimize more than this, but of course, if you're a hardcore overclocker or you're just more lucky with Silicon Lottery, then, well, then you might choose to go higher. Overall, though, the performance gains were pretty modest, but decent. Guardians of the Galaxy, for example, nudged to 70 FPS average with ray tracing and DLSS. Bear in mind, this is with ray tracing set to ultra as well as reflections. So if you turn down the RT just a hair, you would likely up the minimum FPS as well to probably around 60 throughout the game. The rear of the card includes the usual ports you'd expect, a HDMI 2.1 port for VRR goodness at high refresh rates and resolutions, and display ports, 3 of them to be precise, supporting the 1.4 specification. Honestly, the I/O here is pretty much a match for any of Nvidia's other Ampere cards, and that's honestly a good thing. The Nvidia RTX 3050 though, as you probably gathered at this point, is based on Ampere. I've taken several deep dives into Ampere at this stage, but for this particular model, we have 2560 CUDA cores. These are split across 2 graphics processing clusters. There's 80 Tensor and 20 RT cores present on the die for tasks like DLSS and ray tracing. Backing this up is 80 TMUs, texture mapping units, and 32 ROPs. The interesting thing about this card though is perhaps the memory configuration. Nvidia have crammed 8GB of GDDR6 memory on the card. This runs at 14 Gbps on a 128-bit bus, providing the card access to 224GB per second of memory bandwidth. The reference core clocks are a base of 1552, boosting up to 1777. We'll touch more on our specific card in how it overclocks and what boost frequencies it attains later on, but suffice to say for this sample anyway, the frequencies of both the core and memory easily surpass these reference figures. There's also the important question too, how many watts is the card? Well, only 130, at least according to these reference specs. Again, we'll be discussing power draw more later on, as well as overclocking, but frankly, the card did pretty well here. Our RTX 3050 Eagle here is outfitted with a single 8-pin power connector, which, as you can imagine, is ample, if you forgive the pun, to power the card. Speaking of the RTX 3050 Eagle, the card is a dual fan design and is sporting a 2-tone dark grey and black colour theme. The only touch of colour here is the blue on the fans and the Eagle logo on the shroud itself. There's not too much to say about the rear of the card. A backplate exists, and if nothing else, it's better looking anyway than a rear PCB, and does feel a bit safer, so to say, when handling it. Also, I want to address a bit of controversy. Nvidia have actually cut the number of PCIe lanes for the RTX 3050, so we have 8 rather than 16. These are of course PCIe 4. I've double checked with Nvidia and they have actually confirmed that this is true. For those who don't know, PCIe lanes are basically one part of the bandwidth equation. The second, of course, is PCIe generation. PCIe 4.0 offers double the bandwidth over PCIe 3 when all things are equal, i.e. 16 lanes of PCIe 4 offer twice the transfer speed of 16 lanes of PCIe 3.0. AMD have faced a ton of criticism recently by using just 4 lanes for the recently released RX 6500 XT, which is just enough to feed the card when running in a PCIe 4.0 interface, but frame rates really start to take a hit when running in a 3.0 slot, such as if you're running in an older system. The majority of this review was conducted on an Intel i9-10900K, as I'd already gathered results over the time prior to this review, and prior to me being told that there was only 8 lanes available on the card. But after I was told this, I ran some tests on the RTX 3050 using an AMD Ryzen 9 3950X and memory running at 4000 MHz. And basically I just changed the PCIe generation between 3 and 4 in the BIOS. The good news is, for potential RTX 50 owners, there's enough PCIe lanes surviving on the budget RTX 3050 card to not affect performance, at least in our testing. I've also run a few extra benchmarks which I'm not showing here, but really the story is essentially the same. 8 lanes at PCIe 3.0 is enough for this particular GPU. I suspect that the 8GB frame buffer is probably helping things out quite a bit as well, as obviously you don't need to swap data in and out as much as if you only had 4GB. So basically, in conclusion, our tests anyway, for PCIe 3.0 against 4.0, there's basically not much difference, essentially margin of error. But how does the card compare against other contemporary offerings? To answer this question, we'll be running the card with a mixture of standard raster performance, as well as playing around with DLSS and ray tracing too. There'll be another video on the channel, possibly up by the time you see this, or if not shortly thereafter, with more raw gameplay of some titles, so you can check it out if you want to see it. I'll link it in the video description when it's up. But yes, the RTX 3050 is the first 50 class card from Nvidia which does support both DLSS and hardware-based ray tracing. DLSS in particular is a tech which is useful in both lower performance tiers and the bleeding edge, and frankly its existence on the card is a wise move from Nvidia, particularly as Nvidia currently are facing pressure not just from AMD's FSR, but soon Intel's XeSS tech. By the way, you can check the channel where I've gone in a pretty in-depth analysis of XeSS working alongside Intel, as well as AMD's FSR as well, where AMD helped me out with the video. I will try to remember to link both in the video description. Another nice thing though about Nvidia's solution is that we also have access to Nvidia's image scaling, NIS. So for games where DLSS or FSR are not an option, you get to use this driver level toggle. Ironically, Nvidia actually have kind of a leg up on AMD here, as the company have not released its RSR drivers, which basically do the same thing. We'll be also testing the RTX 3050 against an GTX 1050 Ti, a very popular budget GPU. This is particularly true given gamers tend to hold onto their cards for about 2 generations on average. We'll also test against an RTX 3060 to see what you get for spending a few bucks more on Nvidia's next tier, and finally an AMD Radeon RX 5500 XT. I was torn between an RX 480 Polaris card and this, and basically I decided the RX 5500 XT would be the card to test because it's newer and more likely the target of budget gamers rather than Polaris, especially because Polaris is still quite popular with miners. As you can see though from our Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmarks here, the RTX 3060 is comfortably ahead of the RTX 3050, but despite this the 3050 does manage excellent 1080p performance, enabling DLSS at basically any setting, which allows you to enjoy 1440p gaming at the magic 60 FPS mark. Ray tracing is a bit harder though for the card at 1440p, even with DLSS enabled, but turning down RT from say high to medium would easily make you able to get 60 FPS or more at 1440p. Red Dead Redemption is a demanding title, even though it doesn't have hardware-based ray tracing. When you max out the graphics, it's pretty darn taxing. Speaking of maxing out the graphics, we did, with the advanced settings though at default. DLSS though with the RTX 3050 we can't quite break 60 FPS, though 60 would probably be pretty easy if we decided to tweak visuals just a little bit. Now note that the 1050 Ti and RX 5500 XT were only outfitted with 4GB of RAM, so this meant that I had to turn down the texture quality a notch for these particular benchmarks. I decided though to include their results for the sake of completeness. Honestly, this story is pretty consistent throughout our other tests. Borderlands 3 are high settings, we're easily surpassing 70 FPS. Far Cry 6 though is pretty demanding when ray tracing is enabled, even when employing FSR to help reduce the overhead on the GPU. So there you have it, guys, the RTX 3050. Now, this card will be available from $250 MSRP according to the reviewer guide, but of course this is not taking into account retailer gouging. The good news is that mining performance is kind of crappy, as we've already discussed, and I'm told through a couple of sources, one of them an IIB, although none of them of course would like to go on the record, that in terms of the number of cards available, this is probably even a higher number than the RTX 3060 and 3060 Ti. The thing is, while the mining performance is kind of dismal, this card also somewhat rocks for gaming, particularly if you're aiming at a screen like a 1080p target, maybe even lighter 1440p. So I suspect that they will sell out anyway, but yeah, I mean, the good news, at least, is probably they won't be taken up by miners, but again, we'll wait and see on that. Personally, I'm very happy that Nvidia have finally provided RTX features on a 50 series card. With ray tracing, you can certainly play games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider with decent success, especially at 1080p, or even higher if you're willing to compromise a little bit on the ray tracing settings, and of course you're using DLSS, maybe probably in performance mode ideally. But yeah, other games like Resident Evil Village, especially if you're cranking higher resolutions, it's probably not really feasible to run with ray tracing enabled, even if you're using something like FSR. Unfortunately, Resident Evil Village doesn't support DLSS. But again, the real star of the show here is probably Nvidia's DLSS technology. Because sure, you could technically run NIS, or Nvidia Image Scaling, which is something that we've covered rather extensively before, which is basically a spatial upscaler. Nvidia's drivers essentially can do that, you know, without the game itself requiring any support. And also this GPU will support, of course, any FSR titles as well, which is excellent. Speaking of FSR, AMD will soon be releasing RSR as well, which basically does the same thing as NIS. As a side note, I've actually gone quite extensively into the benefits of NIS in a separate video, and FSR actually worked with AMD where they were explaining to me the technology, so you can check that out. The real dark horse of the race though is XeSS, which works similarly to DLSS. I have no idea how the two are going to compare with image quality. We'll have to wait and see on that one, although it has to be said XeSS will still run faster technically on Intel GPUs because of its own instructions. Also, by the way, I've worked with Intel on an XeSS video, and I'll try to remember to link that in the video description as well. So overall conclusions then for the RTX 3050 are pretty positive. Honestly, given the price point, this GPU is pretty good. The biggest problem for me is just, and you guys know what I'm going to say, it's going to be the availability. I suspect, and I'll keep repeating this point, it's probably not going to be the card that really appeals to miners, especially with what's going on with Ethereum and other currencies at the moment. But obviously the cryptocurrency market is so bloody volatile, and it's really difficult to know what's going to happen there anyway. My hope is that these do become available to gamers and there are, you know, high quantities of these GPUs, as honestly, this card from Nvidia does tick all of the right boxes. It doesn't do anything outstanding, you know, it's not the best card that Nvidia have ever released, but it is a good solid release. And I think in this market, honestly, a card that's available at a reasonable price with, unfortunately, a 8GB frame buffer, which despite the fact that we see the number of PCIe lanes cut, at least it has the 8GB of memory. And again, in our testing anyway with the 5950X, I didn't notice any performance degradation. So overall, it's a pretty good card. It hasn't done anything spectacular, but it does everything it needs to do. With that said, thank you very much for checking out the video. I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.